I was standing in my living room folding the quilt that had been draped across the old armchair for years when my daughter's words echoed in my mind. Mom, you can't keep all this junk forever. It's time to downsize. The lamp in the corner, the china cabinet by the wall, even the garden bench outside, each had been silently judged, labeled as clutter to be tossed away. This is just the beginning of my story of clutter turned community. Tell me, where are you watching from? The truth was, I wasn't preparing to let go. I was preparing for something else, though I didn't yet know what. My heart fluttered with a mix of defensiveness and longing. Every object in this house carried a piece of me, a history no one else seemed to value. And then came the moment that shifted everything, the suggestion, almost a command, that I pack up my memories, sell the house, and start over in something smaller. That was the betrayal that lit the spark. So let's get into what happened after that conversation. The house was quiet when everyone left, but their words lingered in the walls. I walked from room to room, almost as if I was seeing my life through their eyes instead of my own. They saw clutter. I saw chapters. Every piece told a story, but when they talked, it felt like none of those stories mattered anymore. In the living room, the armchair became their symbol of everything old-fashioned. To me, it was where my husband used to sit after long shifts, boots still on, sipping tea while pretending not to fall asleep. That chair held the shape of his body. How could I just toss it out because it didn't match some glossy magazine version of simplicity? My daughter had pointed at the lamp in the corner and laughed. She said the shade was faded, that no one used it anyway. She didn't know how many nights I left it on when I was afraid of the dark silence after he passed away. She didn't know how its dim light kept me company when I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The china cabinet was another target. They told me I had no reason to keep so many dishes now that I lived alone. To them, it was wasted space. To me, it was proof that there had once been dinners worth setting a full table for. Holidays, birthdays, late-night meals that turned into arguments, then laughter, then forgiveness. Even the cracks in the dishes had a voice. I heard them say I should sell the souvenirs on the shelf, little trinkets from trips I could barely afford, tucked into suitcases and carried across borders as proof that I had gone somewhere once, that I had lived a little. I ran my finger across a carved wooden figure from a flea market in Spain. The colors had dulled over time, but when I touched it, I remembered the smell of roasted chestnuts from that same street and the sound of a man strumming a guitar. Would any stranger see that? Or would they just see an outdated ornament? Even the garden bench was on their list. They said it blocked the way, that it was rotting, that it served no purpose anymore. But that bench had been my retreat. It was where I drank coffee on quiet mornings, where I cried when no one was looking, where I waited for my son to pull into the driveway and stay long enough for me to feel like I still mattered. Walking through the house, their criticisms replayed in my mind. Downsizing, they called it, making life easier. To me, it felt like erasing, as though the only acceptable version of me was one that had no history, no weight, no proof that I had loved and lost. I sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at the wall, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was holding on to too much. Maybe these objects were nothing but anchors, keeping me from moving forward. I thought about all the ways my life had become smaller already. The phone calls that grew shorter, the holidays where fewer chairs were filled, the sense that I had become more of an obligation than someone to visit freely. But as I stared at the lamp glowing in the corner, I felt something shift. If I let it go, if I followed their advice, what would I have left? A smaller place, fewer memories, and a life that felt like it had been packed into boxes, labeled, and put away. I remembered the look on my daughter's face when she told me to downsize. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was practicality. She believed she was helping. But there was a distance in her tone, like she had already decided I was too fragile to carry my own story. That was the part that stung most. The next morning, I tried to see the house differently. I walked through with a notebook, writing down what each piece meant to me, what it carried. The lamp, the chair, the cabinet, the bench, even the smallest items on the shelf. Each had a line, a connection, a memory. I wasn't ready to discard. I realized I wasn't simply keeping things. I was keeping myself. That realization didn't quiet their voices, though. When I met a friend for coffee later that week, I told her about the pressure to sell, to move, to shrink. She tilted her head and said something I didn't expect. What if you didn't have to get rid of any of it? What if you turned it into something people could enjoy? At first, I thought she was joking. Who would want to pay to stay in a house filled with someone else's memories? But that seed stayed with me, growing quietly, almost against my will. By the time I got home that evening, I found myself looking at the lamp in the corner again. For the first time, I didn't just see an object tied to the past. I saw the possibility that someone else might find comfort in it too. That night, I sat at the table again. Same chair, same lamp, same silence. Only this time, instead of imagining boxes stacked against the walls, I imagined the house alive with voices again. People laughing in the dining room, sitting on the bench in the morning sun, running their fingers along the souvenirs as if they mattered. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of my rebellion. Not against my family, not even against their advice. It was against the idea that my life had already been reduced to something smaller than it was meant to be. I closed the notebook and whispered to myself, maybe they're wrong. Maybe this isn't clutter. Maybe this is my chance. So after that small rebellion grew in my mind, I found myself doing something unusual. Instead of avoiding the house and its silence, I leaned into it. I let myself move slowly through each room, as if I were walking through a museum where the exhibits happened to belong to me. Only, unlike a museum, no one else seemed to care about these pieces. I stopped in the living room first. That quilt on the armchair wasn't just fabric. It carried the faint scent of winters spent curled up watching movies, when life felt fuller, louder. As I folded it back into place, I thought about how quickly time had turned those moments into history. My daughter looked at the same quilt and saw clutter. I saw the sound of laughter, the rhythm of ordinary life before everything changed. I turned to the china cabinet next. Opening its glass doors felt like opening a window into the past. The plates were chipped, yes, but every scratch came from a meal shared with someone I loved. I traced my finger along the edge of a serving dish and thought about the Thanksgiving when we had run out of space at the table, so we crowded in tighter, plates balanced on laps, joking about our casual banquet. No one remembers the cracks in the dishes. They remember the feeling of being together. Then there were the souvenirs. Little figurines, magnets, postcards tucked between books. I picked up a wooden keychain from Greece, still faintly smelling of salt from the sea air. That trip had been the first time I had left the country. I was nervous, clumsy with maps, speaking broken words in a language I did not know. But when I held that keychain, I remembered the pride of being brave enough to go. My children laughed at those trinkets, said they were dust collectors. Maybe they were right. But to me, they were reminders that I had once stepped outside my comfort zone, that I had lived more widely than anyone gave me credit for. The bench outside pulled me last. I opened the sliding door and stepped into the yard. The wood was worn, the paint peeling. If someone else saw it, they might think it was one rain away from collapse. But sitting there, I remembered mornings with coffee in hand, the warmth of the mug steadying me before the day began. I remembered evenings watching the sky turn from blue to gray, hoping someone would visit, hoping I was not forgotten. That bench held my waiting. It also held my persistence. As I moved from room to room, I realized I was carrying on a conversation with the past. Each object had something to say, and I had been listening all along. Maybe that is why it hurt so much when others dismissed them. It was not just the items being reject. It was me. That thought sat heavy in my chest. For years, I had convinced myself I was doing fine, that I did not need validation from anyone. But in those quiet moments, it hit me. I did need it. I wanted my life to be seen, to be acknowledged as something that mattered. These things were not valuable in money, but they were proof of a life that had been full, messy, and real. Later that evening, I sat with the notebook again. Instead of writing what the objects were, I started writing what they meant. I wrote, "The lamp is safety. The chair is partnership. The cabinet is gathering. The souvenirs are courage. The bench is patience. When I looked at those words on the page, it did not feel like clutter anymore. It felt like a map of who I was, drawn through furniture and keepsakes. Even with this realization, the weight of their voices lingered. They wanted me to let go. And a part of me wondered what would happen if I did not. Would I become the woman they whispered about? The one who could not move forward, stuck in a house that looked more like storage than home? Or was I the woman who still had a story to tell, even if no one else wanted to hear it yet? That tension followed me everywhere for days. At night, I would sit in the kitchen with the lamp glowing in the corner and feel torn between two versions of myself. One version packed everything into boxes, moved into a small apartment, and lived quietly with no reminders of what came before. The other version stayed right here, surrounded by these pieces, building something no one expected. The problem was, I did not know what that something could be. It was during one of those nights, staring at the same four walls, that I remembered what my friend had said about AI Airbnb. The idea still sounded strange. Opening my home to strangers? Letting them sleep in these rooms, sit in these chairs, eat at this table? I could not picture it clearly, and yet I could not dismiss it either. The thought lingered, like a question I was not ready to answer. So I went back to the notebook, flipping through the pages filled with words about each object. I tried to imagine how someone else might see them. Would they notice the cracks in the plates? Or would they notice the stories they held? Would they sit on the bench and think it was falling apart? Or would they see the morning sun the way I did? For the first time, I wondered if my house could be more than a container for memories. What if it became a place where new ones were made? The night ended with that question echoing in my mind. I did not have answers yet. I only had the ache of being underestimated, the pull of my past, and the faint flicker of a possibility I was not ready to name. But the seed was there, planted quietly, waiting for me to notice it. So the question would not leave me alone. It followed me like a whisper I could not shake off. Could this house be more than a burden, more than a museum of my past? The thought was ridiculous one moment and tempting the next. One afternoon, I met my friend again. She had a way of bringing things up casually, like dropping pebbles into still water. "You should try hosting," she said, sipping her coffee. "People pay good money to stay in homes with character." I laughed out loud, almost spilling my cup. "Character? My kids call it junk." She shrugged. "Then maybe junk is what people want. Not everything has to be shiny and new." Her words unsettled me. And I came home, I looked around, differently. For the first time, I tried to imagine what a stranger might see. Would they notice the faded lamp? Or would they see a cozy glow in the corner? Would they mock the cabinet or admire the history inside? That night, I sat in the living room and pulled the lamp closer. Its shade was crooked, and the base had scratches, but when it lit the room, it felt warm. I dragged a chair next to it and set a book on the table. For the first time in years, I staged something. Not for myself, but for someone who was not even here yet. It was such a small gesture, but it stirred something inside me. Later, I walked through the rooms as if I were preparing for invisible guests. In my head, I imagined their footsteps on the wooden floor, their laughter in the kitchen, their curiosity about the souvenirs. Each scenario made me nervous, but also strangely excited. Still, the doubts came quickly. Who would stay here? What if they found it outdated, embarrassing? What if my family found out and laughed at the idea? I could almost hear their voices already. "Mom, you are being unrealistic." But another thought rose to the surface, one I had not allowed myself to hold on to before. What if they were wrong? What if these things, my so-called clutter, were not proof that I was stuck in the past, but proof that I had lived? And what if someone else could see the value in that? I went back to the notebook and wrote 2 simple words: try once. The next morning, I sat at the computer and hesitated with my fingers on the keyboard. I searched how to start an Airbnb and felt ridiculous. Reading the steps made me both anxious and curious. Photos, descriptions, pricing, reviews. It all seemed overwhelming, but also strangely possible. I did not tell anyone what I was doing. It felt too fragile, like a candle that could be blown out with one careless comment. Instead, I picked one room, the smallest one at the end of the hall. It was simple, quiet, easy to prepare. I cleaned it slowly, paying attention to details I had ignored before. I polished the lamp my daughter hated and set it on a table beside the bed. I fluffed the pillows, smoothed the sheets, and tucked the quilt tightly. The room looked plain, but welcoming. For a brief moment, I felt proud. Taking pictures was harder. The camera showed every flaw, every chip in the paint, every wrinkle in the fabric. I almost gave up right there. But then I thought about my friend's words again. Not everything has to be shiny and new. Maybe what I had was enough. When I uploaded the photos and typed out the description, my hands shook. I wrote honestly, a quiet room in a lived-in home. Warm light, shelves with souvenirs, a bench in the garden. No exaggeration, no sales pitch, just the truth. Hitting publish was like jumping into cold water. I sat frozen for a while afterward, staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen. Of course, nothing did right away. The house was still silent. The lamp still glowed in the corner. But I had done it. For the first time in a long while, I had taken a step not toward shrinking my life, but toward opening it. That night, lying in bed, I felt restless. What if no one booked? What if this experiment confirmed everything my family had said? But beneath the nerves, there was a spark of something else, something I had not felt in years. Hope. So once the listing went live, I thought relief would follow. Instead, the waiting felt heavier than I expected. Every time my phone buzzed, I grabbed it, half hoping, half dreading that it might be a booking request. Hours passed, then a day. The silence was loud, like tea. The house was holding its breath with me. Still, I could not sit still. I walked back into the little room I had photographed and studied it again. The lamp gave off a warm circle of light on the nightstand. The quilt looked neat, though not perfect. I noticed the uneven paint on the wall, the creak in the floorboards, and wondered if I had made a mistake. Who would want to stay in a house that wore its age so openly? But then I remembered something my friend had said. People are not looking for perfect. They are looking for real. I repeated those words to myself like a shield. Maybe real was enough. The following morning, I decided to test my courage further. I walked through the rest of the house with new eyes. Could the dining room become more than a place I ate alone? Could the shelves with souvenirs feel like a gallery instead of clutter? I opened the china cabinet and arranged the dishes with more care than I had in years. Some were chipped, but when lined up together, they looked intentional, almost like a story told in porcelain. I pressed accept with trembling hands. It was official. Someone was coming. The days before her arrival felt like preparing for a performance. I scrubbed every corner of that room until my back ached. I polished the lamp again, even though it would never shine like new. I set out clean towels, folded carefully on the bed. For the first time in years, I bought fresh flowers and placed them in a vase by the window. The whole time I kept wondering what she would see that I could not. The morning she was due, I woke before sunrise. I walked through the house in silence, adjusting tiny details, straightening picture frames, smoothing blankets, checking that the cabinet doors closed properly. The house seemed to hum with nervous energy, as if it too was waiting. When the knock finally came, my chest tightened. I opened the door, and there she was, smiling, suitcase in hand, thanking me for letting her stay. She walked into the room, looked around, and her eyes landed on the lamp. She smiled. "I love this corner," she said softly. "It feels so inviting." I froze. The same lamp my daughter had laughed at, called outdated, even embarrassing. This stranger saw something different. She saw warmth. She saw comfort. After she settled in, I sat in the kitchen alone, tears welling in my eyes. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in a long while, someone outside my memories had validated what I held dear. What others mocked, she admired. That single comment was more powerful than she could have known. That weekend passed quietly. She came and went, always polite, always grateful. When she left, she wrote a short review. A cozy, welcoming stay. The house has so much character. I felt at home right away. Reading her words, I felt something inside me shift. Maybe this was not just an experiment. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small. I felt seen. After she left, the silence of the house returned, but it was not the same silence as before. The walls no longer felt like barriers pressing in on me. Instead, they felt like witnesses, holding on to her kind words, echoing them back whenever I doubted myself. For years, I had lived with the weight of other people's judgments, my daughter's dismissive remarks, the way relatives snickered at my habits, even the silence of friends who no longer visited. All of it had shaped the way I saw myself. Their voices had become my own. So when that young woman stood in my living room and smiled at the lamp, when she called my house inviting, something shifted inside me. For the first time in a long while, I questioned whether the voices of my family deserved to be the loudest. That evening, after she checked out, I sat in the very room she had slept in. I stared at the empty bed, the vase with its wilting flowers, the folded towels she had not used. I whispered the word she had left me with. Cozy. A simple word, but it landed deeper than she could have imagined. Cozy was not just about furniture or decor. Cozy meant safe, cared for, seen. She had experienced my space differently than the way my family had dismissed it. The review she left online became more than just a few sentences on a screen. It was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I thought had vanished. Reading it, I did not see failure or neglect. I saw someone capable of creating a home that could comfort a stranger. I saw worth in the cracks, value in the details I had once thought were flaws. I carried my phone into the kitchen and read her review aloud, as if reciting it could etch the words deeper into my heart. I even read it twice, standing there barefoot on the cool tile floor, letting each syllable wash over me. A part of me wanted to call my daughter and prove her wrong, but another part of me held back. Why should I need her approval anymore? Why should her judgment continue to hold me hostage? Instead, I made a quiet choice that night. I lit a candle on the dining table, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and poured myself a cup. I sat down in the chair I always used to avoid, the one across from the empty space my husband once filled. I did not rush. I did not hide. I simply sat there, savoring the tea, as though I was a guest in my own home. For the first time in years, I felt comfortable in my own presence. Over the next few days, I found myself walking through the house with new eyes again. The creaking floorboard in the hallway no longer felt like an embarrassment. It felt like character. The mismatched china was not a flaw. It was history. Even the worn quilt with its uneven stitches carried weight. I remembered sewing some of those patches myself when my children were young, my hands trembling with inexperience. Now, those imperfect stitches looked almost brave. I realized something vital. The guest had not just validated my home, she had validated me. She saw worth in the same things I had been taught to devalue. She proved that another perspective existed, one that was kinder, one that did not measure me against impossible standards. At night, lying in bed, I replayed small moments from her visit. The way she paused in the hallway to look at the family photos. The way she leaned toward the figurine from Spain and asked about it, her eyes curious. I had brushed off her question at the time, not knowing how to explain its meaning. But in the and after she left, I remembered how I got it, on a trip I had saved for years to take. A trip that proved I could stand on my own when I needed to. That figurine was not just wood carved into shape. It was evidence of a time I had chosen myself over obligation. Her stay reminded me that stories still lived in these walls. Stories I had silenced because others did not value them. She had woken them up. A week later, another booking request appeared. This time, I did not hesitate. I accepted, not with trembling hands, but with steady resolve. The fear was not gone, but it was quieter. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was not just about renting out a room. This was about reclaiming my own story, one guest at a time. The second guest arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I remember the sound of his umbrella snapping shut as he stood on the porch, shaking off the drizzle before stepping inside. He was older than the first guest, perhaps in his late 50s, with a travel-worn suitcase and a tired look in his eyes. When he crossed the threshold, I felt less of the panic that had filled me the first time. My hands did not tremble as much when I offered him tea. He accepted with a grateful nod, his shoulders dropping as though he had finally found a place to rest. That look, of relief, of settling into safety, stayed with me. It was the same look I used to long for when I visited relatives, the look I had searched for in my daughter's living room, but never found. Yet here he was, a stranger, and in my home he found what I had been denied in theirs. After he left, I realized something important. Hosting was not just about offering a bed. It was about offering dignity. In a world that can be cold and indifferent, people needed a space where they could breathe. And somehow I had created that. One booking turned into another, then another. Each guest carried their own story, fragments of their lives brushing against mine like passing shadows. A nurse traveling for work, a grandmother visiting her grandchildren, a young couple saving money while they searched for a house. With every stay, I learned something new, not just about them, but about myself. I learned I was resourceful. When the sink clogged, I figured out how to fix it instead of waiting for someone else. When the heater stopped working one chilly night, I called the repairman myself, no longer afraid of being dismissed or overcharged. For years, I had told myself I was not capable. My husband had managed the bills, my daughter had managed my decisions. But standing on my own, running this small part of my life, I proved those voices wrong. Still, the contrast was hard to ignore. While strangers valued what I offered, my own family continued to treat me like background noise. My daughter rarely called, and when she did, her words carried the same sharp edge. "You're wasting your time," she once said when I mentioned the guests. "Nobody really cares about that." But they did care. I had the reviews to prove it. Guests left notes thanking me for my kindness, for the little touches that made them feel at home. They praised the meals, the comfortable room, the warmth of the space. Each review became a piece of armor, protecting me against the dismissals of those who should have loved me best. I began saving the reviews in a notebook. I copied them word for word, sometimes reading them aloud when doubt crept in. It was not vanity. It was survival. It was a reminder that my worth could no longer be dictated by those unwilling to see it. One evening, after the third or fourth guest had left, I stood in the living room and looked around. For years, this house had felt like a prison of memories. Every corner reminded me of what had been lost, arguments, disappointments, the echo of absence. But now, the same walls felt alive again. They carried laughter, conversations, footsteps. The air did not feel heavy anymore. I began to realize that I was not just hosting guests. I was hosting myself. With each booking, I reclaimed a piece of the woman I had once been, the woman who had dreams, who once believed her voice mattered. And though my daughter's voice still lingered in my head, I started to notice it less. Her criticisms no longer pierced as deeply. I could see her words for what they were. Echoes of her own bitterness, not truths about me. What struck me most was this. I had spent years waiting for validation from my family, begging silently for their approval. Yet it was strangers, people passing through my life for just a few nights, who gave me what I needed. Not pity, not judgment, but recognition. That recognition became fuel. It was not about proving anything to my daughter anymore. It was about proving something to myself, that my life still had meaning, that my presence still carried weight. The more guests came, the more I believed it. By the time the 7th or 8th guest had passed through my door, I started to notice the way I carried myself differently. My shoulders were not as hunched. My steps did not shuffle the way they used to. Even in the mirror, though I still saw the lines carved deep from years of strain, I also saw something else. Quiet strength. So when the phone rang one afternoon and my daughter's name appeared on the screen, I did not feel the familiar jolt of panic. For the first time in years, I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice came through sharp, clipped. "I need you to watch the kids this weekend," she said, not as a question, but as a command. "I have guests coming," I replied, calm but firm. The words surprised even me. For decades, I had rearranged my life at her slightest request, but now I did not want to cancel my plans for people who respected my time more than she ever had. There was silence, then a scoff. "Guests? You mean those strangers you keep dragging into your house? Mother, you're too old to be doing this. It's ridiculous." Her dismissal used to cut me to the bone. But that day, I heard her differently. I heard her fear, her impatience, maybe even her resentment. But not truth. "I can't this weekend," I said again, steady this time. "You'll have to make other arrangements." The line went cold for a moment before she hung up without another word. Afterward, I sat in the quiet, waiting for the guilt to come rushing in. But instead, I felt something I had not felt in years. Relief. I had drawn a boundary. And though it might have cost me her approval, it gave me back a piece of myself. The next morning, I replayed the conversation in my head. Part of me worried I had made things worse, but another part whispered that maybe it was long overdue. For so long, I had let her voice drown mine out. And now, at last, my voice had risen. A week later, she came over unannounced. She walked through the door without knocking, the way she always had. I was preparing the guest room for another booking, fluffing pillows and setting out clean towels. She watched me for a long moment, her arms crossed. "Why are you wasting time on this?" she asked, her tone dripping with contempt. I turned, holding a folded sheet in my hands. "It's not a waste," she shook her head. "You should be focusing on your family, not strangers." The words stung because in them was the painful truth I had lived with for so long. Her definition of family was control, not care. I laid the sheet on the bed carefully, smoothing it, with my palms before answering. "Family is not supposed to treat you like you're invisible." Her face hardened. "Oh, so now you're saying we do not care about you?" Really looked at her. For years I had tried to please this woman who had once been a little girl clinging to my hand. But standing there, I realized she no longer saw me as her mother. She saw me as an obstacle, someone she could command or dismiss. "I'm saying," I said slowly, "that I will not keep living like I do not matter." She let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You're being dramatic." "Maybe," I said, straightening the pillows. "But it feels better than being silent." For a moment, I thought she might storm out. Instead, she muttered something under her breath and wandered into the kitchen. I stayed in the room, letting her words hang in the air without rushing to smooth them over. That, too, was new. That evening, after she left, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea. The silence did not feel heavy anymore. It felt like freedom. Of course, it was not easy. The loneliness returned in waves. Sometimes I missed the closeness we had once shared, back when she was younger and looked to me with trust instead of disdain. Sometimes I ached for a phone call filled with warmth instead of barbs. But longing for the past did not change the truth of the present. And the truth was this: I could not control how my daughter treated me. I could only control whether I allowed it to define me. The next time she called, her tone was the same, dismissive and impatient. But I heard it differently. I realized I no longer needed her validation to feel whole. That shift frightened me at first. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in motherhood, in being needed. Without that, who was I? But as more guests came and went, leaving behind words of thanks and small tokens of kindness, I began to see the answer. I was someone who mattered, not because of the title of mother or grandmother, but because I was human. And being human was enough. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing in particular was supposed to change. The laundry was tumbling in the machine. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and sunlight spilled across the floor in long, golden streaks. I had just finished tidying up when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a couple in their 60s, carrying small suitcases. They were my next guests, travelers from out of town who had booked 2 nights. Their faces were kind, lined in ways that spoke of years lived fully, and when they stepped inside, the house seemed to come alive. Over tea, we talked about small things at first: traffic, weather, the quirks of old houses. Then, as often happens when strangers feel unexpectedly safe, the conversation turned deeper. The wife leaned forward, her voice soft. She said, "It's rare to find a place that feels this welcoming. You must put a lot of yourself into it." Her words startled me. I had never thought of it that way. To me, the guest house was survival, a way to pay bills and distract myself from the emptiness of the rooms. But in her eyes, it was more. It was care, intention, warmth. Later that evening, while they settled in, I stood in the quiet hall and let her words echo inside me. You must put a lot of yourself into it. For the first time, I realized that I had been creating something of value, not for recognition, not for family approval, but simply by being who I was. Every clean sheet, every vase of flowers, every cup of tea, these were not just chores. They were gestures of dignity, proof that even when others had dismissed me, I had never stopped showing up for life. The next morning, the husband thanked me before they left for a day trip. "You remind me of my sister," he said. "She was the backbone of our family, though no one ever told her enough. People like you hold the world together." I stood there long after the door closed, the words settling over me like a blanket. People like you hold the world together. For so long, I had lived believing I was disposable, useful only when needed, invisible when not. But these strangers, who had no stake in me, saw something else. And slowly, I began to see it too. That afternoon, I pulled out an old photo album. Dust clung to the cover, and the edges of the pages had curled. I flipped through pictures of myself at 20, 30, 40, smiling at birthdays, holding my children, standing in kitchens, gardens, and church halls. In every photo, I saw a woman who had given everything she had. And then I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask. What if all along, I was enough, even when no one said so? The question stayed with me. It lingered when I set the table for dinner, when I took a walk down the street, when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, the lines around my mouth, the gray in my hair. These were not signs of fading. They were proof I had endured. One evening, I lit a candle and sat quietly at the kitchen table. I thought about the years of silence, the countless times I had swallowed my pain to keep peace. I thought about my daughter's sharp words, my relatives' indifference, and instead of letting the grief crush me, I whispered to the empty room, "You did not break me." It felt strange at first, almost foolish, speaking aloud to no one. But the words carried weight. They filled the air. They belonged to me. The next day, I decided to do something I had been putting off for years. I took a bus into town, walked into a small stationery shop, and bought a fresh journal. The cover was plain, a muted blue, but when I held it, I felt like I was holding a doorway. That night, I wrote the first page. This is where I tell the truth. No more pretending. No more silence. The pen moved slowly at first, but once the words started, they came faster. I wrote about the years of feeling unseen, about the shame of not being appreciated, about the longing that had followed me like a shadow. But I also wrote about survival, about the small joys, flowers blooming outside the window, laughter shared with strangers, the comfort of my own steady hands at work. Page after page, I began to stitch together a story I had never given myself permission to tell. And in those stories, I discovered a woman who had endured storms without collapsing, who had given without guarantee of return, who had faced neglect, yet still chosen love. That discovery became the turning point, because once you see yourself clearly, you cannot unsee it. The following week, when my daughter called again, her tone was as sharp as ever. But something in me had shifted. I no longer felt the urge to explain, to defend, to beg for her kindness. Instead, I answered with calm, short sentences, protecting my energy like a shield. After I hung up, I did not replay the conversation endlessly in my head. I did not cry into my pillow. I simply carried on, setting out fresh towels for the guests arriving that evening. That was when it truly hit me. The life I was building, small, quiet, steady, was mine. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. The turning point was not loud or dramatic. There was no confrontation, no sweeping declaration. It was quieter than that, like the way dawn creeps in slowly before anyone notices. But it was real. And once it began, there was no turning back. The first sign that something inside me had changed was subtle. It was not fireworks or a sudden burst of courage. It was a quiet morning when I woke up before dawn and, instead of lying in bed with that old heaviness pressing against my chest, I simply got up. I brewed coffee, wrapped myself in a sweater, and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the smell of wet grass. For years I had missed mornings like this, always too distracted by stress or sorrow to notice them. But that day, I stood on the porch, sipping slowly, watching the sun rise. It was not a grand event, but it felt like a gift. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself take it. That became the beginning of a different rhythm. I started claiming small pieces of joy, the kind I had once thought were luxuries reserved for other people. A walk around the neighborhood without rushing, cooking a meal just for myself, seasoning it exactly how I liked it, and setting the table with care, even if I was the only one eating. At first, guilt crept in. Old habits whispered, "You're selfish. You should be doing more for others. You should be proving your worth." But each time the guilt rose, I countered it with a firm truth. I had given for decades, often without return. Now taking an hour for myself was not selfish. It was survival turned into something softer, something closer to freedom. One afternoon, I wandered into the community center where flyers lined the walls. Yoga classes, watercolor painting, gardening clubs, book groups. For years, I had walked past those doors, too self-conscious to step inside, worried that I would not belong. But that day, I paused. My hand hovered over a flyer for a weekly book discussion. I was not sure why that one stood out, but I folded it into my bag before I could second-guess myself. The following Tuesday, I walked into the small classroom with rows of mismatched chairs. A dozen people, mostly women my age or older, sat in a circle, holding paperbacks. The discussion was casual, a little messy, full of laughter. I listened more than I spoke that first night, but something inside me loosened. Nobody was demanding anything from me. Nobody was keeping score. I was simply there, part of something, and it was enough. Week after week, I returned. Slowly, I began to speak up. Sometimes about the book, sometimes about memories the stories brought back. And to my surprise, people listened. They nodded, responded, asked questions. My words did not disappear into silence the way they so often had in my family. One evening, as I was leaving, a woman touched my arm and said, "I hope you keep coming. Your perspective adds so much." It was a small comment, but it stayed with me all night. That was the moment I realized joy does not always arrive as laughter or excitement. Sometimes joy is being seen, truly seen, without judgment. The more I allowed myself those spaces, the stronger I felt. The phone calls from my daughter continued, often sharp, sometimes dismissive. But instead of letting her words define my day, I began setting limits. If the conversation turned cruel, I ended it politely. No long explanations, no tears, just a simple boundary. It was not easy. The first time I hung up, my hands trembled. My heart pounded. But after a few minutes, I noticed something remarkable. The world did not collapse. She did not come storming to my door. Life carried on. And in that silence, I felt lighter. I started applying that lesson everywhere. If someone at church made a cutting remark, I did not swallow it down. I either addressed it calmly or walked away. If a relative called only to gossip or criticize, I limited the conversation. I no longer carried every burden placed in my hands. At first, people resisted. Some grew colder, some tried harder to push my buttons. But I held my ground. Each time I protected my peace, I discovered a little more of myself. And here was the biggest surprise. Once I made space, new things began to grow. I signed up for a painting class on Saturday mornings. The first time I dipped the brush into the paint, I felt awkward, almost embarrassed. My lines were crooked, my colors too bright. But the teacher, a retired man with kind eyes, said, "There is no wrong way to put yourself on the canvas." So I kept going. Week after week, I painted sunsets, old houses, even a messy bouquet of flowers. The paintings were not perfect, but they were mine. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a part of me I had buried years ago. In the evenings, I sometimes invited guests staying at the house to sit with me for tea. We shared stories about where we had been, what we had lost, what we had found again. These connections were not deep friendships, but they were real. And in every story I heard, I found reminders that I was not alone. Everyone carried wounds. Everyone longed for healing. Slowly, joy stopped feeling like something I had to chase. It started showing up naturally, in laughter during book club, in colors on canvas, in the quiet moments on my porch. I realized something vital then. My family could withhold their approval forever, but it no longer controlled my worth. I was building a life that belonged to me, not shaped by guilt or duty, but by choice. One evening, I stood in the kitchen preparing a simple meal, fresh bread, a bowl of soup, a small salad. I set the table for one, lit a candle, and sat down. The room was silent except for the soft tick of the clock. For years, I would have seen this as loneliness, proof of all I had lost. But that night, I saw it differently. This was peace. This was me. Alive, nourished, whole. It was not the life I had once imagined, but it was mine. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to apologize for it. For much of my life, forgiveness was a word I heard in sermons, in books, in conversations where people spoke about it as if it were simple. Just let it go, they would say, as though you could peel grief and betrayal off your skin like an old coat and leave it behind. But living through what I had lived through, I knew better. Forgiveness was not quick, it was not easy, and it was not something I owed anyone just because they shared my blood. Still, as the years moved forward, I began to see that forgiveness was not about excusing what had been done to me. It was about loosening the grip the past still had on my heart. I had spent too many years carrying the sharp edges of other people's choices. They had cut into me daily, reopening wounds long after the battles were over. And I realized, if I did not put them down, I would keep bleeding forever. It started with the smallest step. I sat at my kitchen table one afternoon with a notebook and a pen. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to ache, but now felt steady. I wrote down the names of those who had hurt me. My daughter, my late husband, a sister who had turned cold, a few friends who had walked away when I needed them most. I let the list sit there in black ink, stark and undeniable. Then, next to each name, I wrote what I had carried because of them. Not in vague words, but in clear truths. Made me feel invisible, took without giving back, lied about me, left me out. The list grew long, and for a moment I thought I would drown in it. But I did not stop. After every wound I wrote, I release this from owning me. Not I forgive them entirely. Not. It didn't matter. Just I release this from owning me. My hand shook as I wrote, and tears blurred the page, but when I finished, the weight on my chest had shifted. That became my ritual. Every time the past tried to pull me back into bitterness, I repeated the words, I release this from owning me. Over time, I felt the edges dull. The memories did not vanish, but they lost their power to dictate how I moved through my days. Forgiving my daughter was the hardest. For so long, I had confused forgiveness with reconciliation. I thought that if I forgave her, it meant opening my arms again, inviting her to treat me the same way. But as I sat with the idea longer, I saw the difference. Forgiveness was something I could do within myself, while reconciliation required two willing people. She was not willing. and maybe she never would be. That did not mean I had to keep swallowing the poison of resentment. One night, I wrote her a letter. I did not send it. I knew she would not read it, or if she did, she would twist the words. But I poured everything onto the page. I wrote about my love for her, my grief over what had been lost, my anger at how she had treated me. And at the end, I wrote, I forgive you in the sense that I will no longer let this destroy me. I wish you peace, whether or not you ever stand beside me again. Then I folded the letter and tucked it away in a box. It was not for her. It was for me. Forgiveness did not mean I let her back into my life without boundaries. It did not mean I pretended nothing had happened. It meant I no longer let her choices decide the condition of my spirit. That distinction freed me. As I practiced this, I began to notice a shift in how I saw myself too. For years, I had blamed myself for staying too long, for bending too much, for not standing up sooner. The voice of shame whispered, "You allowed this. You failed to stop it." But as I worked through forgiveness, I realized I needed to extend it inward as well. So I wrote another list, this time of the mistakes I believed I had made. Didn't speak up, believed their lies, gave too much, stayed silent when I should have walked away. And next to each one, I wrote, I forgive myself. I was surviving with the tools I had. That was harder than forgiving anyone else. But slowly, it took root. I began to see myself not as weak, but as someone who had endured, who had kept going even when it seemed impossible. Forgiving myself did not erase the pain, but it gave me back my dignity. I started to share bits of this journey in quiet conversations. At book club, when a story touched on betrayal, I admitted that I understood what it felt like to be wounded by someone you loved. At church, when a woman spoke about struggling to forgive her brother, I told her, you don't have to do it for them. Do it for yourself. I was not preaching. I was simply passing on what I had learned in the hardest way possible. The more I spoke, the more I saw that forgiveness was not a single act, but a practice. Some days I woke up steady, filled with peace. Other days, anger bubbled up again. On those days, I did not shame myself. I reminded myself that forgiveness is a path, not a destination. And as long as I kept walking, I was free. One afternoon, months after beginning this process, I returned to the cemetery where my husband was buried. For years, I had avoided it, too, weighed down by bitterness to stand by his stone. But that day, I walked slowly down the path carrying a small bunch of wildflowers. I stood in front of the grave and let the silence surround me. For a long time, I said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I said, I forgive you. Not for everything, not for the harm that could never be undone, but enough that I no longer carried his choices like chains around my neck. I placed the flowers at the base of the stone and walked away. The air felt lighter. My steps, freer. Forgiveness did not erase my story. It did not erase the people who had hurt me, but it untangled me from them. It gave me back my future. Acceptance came alongside it. Not acceptance of what had been done, but acceptance of where I stood now. I stopped asking why. I stopped hoping for apologies that would never come. Instead, I turned my gaze forward. Life was not perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sky darken, I realized something I had never believed before. I was at peace. Not because the wounds had vanished, but because I no longer let them rule me. I had forgiven, not for their sake, but for mine. Looking back, it almost feels like I have lived several lifetimes inside one. There were years swallowed by heartbreak, seasons marked by loneliness, and moments that cut so deep I wondered if I would ever breathe freely again. But there were also small miracles, laughter I did not expect, kindness that arrived at the exact right time, and the unshakable truth that even broken hearts can keep beating. If there is one thing this journey has taught me, it is that pain does not have the final word. People may betray you, families may fracture, trust may shatter, and yet you can still rise from the wreckage. You can still CH. Oos. How you will live with what happened. And that choice makes all the difference. For so long, I thought strength meant holding everything in, keeping my head high, pretending nothing hurt. But real strength looks different. It is allowing yourself to cry until your chest aches. It is admitting that someone you love has caused harm. It is choosing to walk away when staying would only destroy you. Strength, I learned, is not about pretending you are unbreakable. It is about learning how to put yourself back together, piece by piece. If you are listening to this and you feel stuck in the middle of your own storm, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not weak because you are hurting. You are not foolish for having trusted. And you are not alone, even if it feels like no one understands. I know how heavy that silence can feel. I know how sharp betrayal cuts. But I also know this. The wound does not have to define you. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was that closure does not come from the people who hurt us. It does not come from apologies that never arrive or explanations that make sense of the senseless. Closure is something we create within ourselves. It is the moment we decide that their choices will not hold our future hostage. It is the day we take back the pen and start writing our story again. For me, that looked like reclaiming small things first, making a cup of tea and actually tasting it, going for walks without feeling the shadow of what had been said to me, calling a friend not to vent, but to share a laugh. These tiny acts reminded me that life was not just about surviving betrayal, it was about living despite it. And over time, those small acts built something stronger. They built a new sense of self, one not defined by what others had taken, but by what I chose to build. That is the part I want you to remember. You can rebuild. No matter how badly someone tried to break you, you can create a life that is yours, and it can be good again. That does not mean it will look the same. My family does not look the way I once pictured it. Some chairs at my table are still empty, and they may always be. But I have filled those spaces with people who bring kindness, honesty, and warmth. They are not replacements. They are blessings of their own. And I have learned to treasure what I have, instead of clinging to what will never return. Sometimes people ask me if I would change my past, would I erase the betrayals, undo the heartbreak, rewrite the chapters where everything fell apart? The truth is complicated. Of course, I wish I had not been hurt. Of course, I wish the people closest to me had chosen differently. But if I erased it all, I would not be who I am today. I would not have learned the depth of my own resilience. I would not have found the peace that comes after surviving the fire. So while I will never say I am glad it happened, I can say I am grateful for the strength it forced me to uncover. And that is where I want to leave you. Not in despair, not in bitterness, but in the reminder that no matter what has been done to you, you still hold the power to shape your future. Your worth is not measured by who stayed or who left. Your identity is not defined by the lies told about you, and your future is not limited by the cruelty of others. It took me decades to believe this, but now I carry it like a promise. I am more than what I lost. I am more than what they said. I am more than the pain I endured. And so are you. So if you are standing in the ashes of broken trust, if you are replaying words that cut too deep, if you are wondering how to take the next step, start small. Breathe. Write your pain down and release it. Build boundaries without guilt. Let yourself laugh even when the past whispers you shouldn't. And remind yourself daily, you deserve peace. You deserve love that doesn't wound. You deserve a life that feels whole. I cannot promise the road will be easy. Healing is rarely smooth, but I can promise it is possible. And I can tell you, from the other side of years of darkness, that there will come a day when the weight lifts. When you realize you have forgiven, not for them, but for yourself. When you sit in the quiet and feel at home again in your own heart, that is the day worth holding on for. So as I close this chapter of my story, I want to leave you with this. Betrayal may change the shape of your life, but it does not have to steal the core of who you are. You are stronger than you know. You are braver than you feel. And even if your family, your friends, or the people closest to you failed you, you can still choose to rise. I did, and so can you. When the dust finally settles, what remains is choice. That is what I have learned. I can keep circling the ruins of what was lost, or I can turn and face what is still ahead. For too long, my life was defined by the betrayals I endured, the silence that lingered after, and the weight of unanswered questions. But now, I am ready to step into something different. I am not erasing the past, but I am no longer letting it chain me. This is my new chapter. The truth is, starting again does not always look dramatic. It is not a grand announcement, not a perfect sunrise, not a sudden rush of clarity. More often, it is small, ordinary decisions that slowly build into something new. For me, it began with giving myself permission to dream again. Not the kind of dreams that depend on other people's approval, but the kind that live quietly at the back of your heart, waiting to be heard. I started writing them down. Learn something new. Plant a small garden. Take a trip I always put off. Read the books that have waited too long. These may sound like little things, but after years of living under the shadow of heartbreak, they felt like rebellion. They were proof that my life could still belong to me, that it could be shaped by joy instead of survival. In this new chapter, I have also had to accept that forgiveness does not automatically mean reunion. Some people will remain outside my life, and that is the healthiest choice for me. For a while, I resisted that truth. I kept thinking healing meant restoring what was broken. But I have come to see, healing sometimes means walking forward without those who hurt you. It means blessing them on their path while keeping your own boundaries strong. And that is okay. What surprises me most is how peaceful this realization feels. I thought moving on would feel heavy, but instead, it feels like laying down a burden I was never meant to carry. I can finally breathe without waiting for the next betrayal. I can live without rehearsing old arguments in my mind. The silence that once felt unbearable has become the space where new life can grow. This does not mean the pain is gone. It lingers, sometimes in ways I cannot predict. A familiar smell, a song, a photograph tucked in a drawer. They can still bring a sting to my chest. But pain does not rule me anymore. It visits. It reminds me. But it does not control my days. That, to me, is freedom. In this new chapter, I want to focus on building something lasting, something that reflects the lessons I have learned. I want my life to be filled with relationships rooted in respect, honesty, and care. I want to offer love without fear, but also without the naivety that once blinded me. I have learned the value of discernment, the ability to see people for who they are, not just who I hope they will be, and just maybe. That is where real peace begins. There's also a new desire in me to share, not just my pain, but my growth. If my story can remind even one person that they are not defined by betrayal, then all the nights I cried alone were not wasted. Sometimes I think the deepest wounds we carry can become bridges, connecting us to others who need to know they're not alone in their struggle. Maybe that's what this chapter is about. Turning pain into connection, turning survival into purpose. And while I'm moving forward with determination, I'm also learning to move gently. I don't have to rush into the future as if I'm running from the past. I can take my time, savoring the life I'm building piece by piece, whether it's sitting quietly in the morning sun, sharing a meal with someone I trust, or daring to laugh in places where sorrow once lived. I see each moment as a step forward. What's beautiful is realizing that hope doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sneaks in during the most ordinary moments. A neighbor's smile, the comfort of a warm blanket, the simple pleasure of finishing a task you've put off for too long. Hope is not always dramatic. It's steady, waiting, persistent. And in this new chapter, I want to notice it more often. There's also courage in admitting that I don't know exactly what the future holds. For someone who has lived through betrayal, uncertainty used to feel terrifying. I wanted guarantees, promises carved in stone, proof that no one could hurt me again. But now I see life differently. Certainty isn't possible. What I can have, though, is trust in myself. Trust that no matter what comes, I'll handle it with the strength I've already proven I carry. So yes, this is a new chapter. Not because the past has been erased, but because I refuse to let it be the only story I tell. I want to fill these next pages with resilience, laughter, quiet joys, and second chances. I want my rye to remind others that even when everything feels lost, new beginnings are possible. Maybe you're standing at the edge of your own new chapter. Maybe the wounds are still fresh, or maybe you've been carrying them for years. Wherever you are, I want to remind you of this. Your story is not finished. You still have blank pages ahead. And no matter what's been done to you, no one else gets to write them but you. This isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about deciding that the past won't be the author of your future. You get to choose the tone, the rhythm, the direction. You get to choose who sits at your table, what peace looks like in your home, and what kind of love you allow in your heart. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I am saying it's worth it. Every step you take toward your own healing is an act of courage. Every time you choose peace over bitterness, you're proving to yourself that you are stronger than the betrayal that tried to break you. And every day you keep going, you're writing a story worth telling. So here I am, turning the page. The past is part of me, but it is not the whole of me. I carry it, but it no longer defines me. What defines me now is the choice to keep living, to keep loving, to keep creating a future that feels like mine. Before I close, I'll leave you with this. Turning my home into an Airbnb wasn't the only surprise life had for me. In my next story, I'll share the day a family secret came out at the worst possible moment and how it changed everything. Don't miss it. Watch that next video now.